At that dinner, she thought she was testing my patience, but what she didn't realize was that I had already decided she wouldn't get a single ounce of it. I noticed it the moment I stepped into the dining room. The way the table had been rearranged just slightly off from how I remembered it, as if someone had shifted the pieces of a familiar board game just enough to make you question your own memory. And there, at the far end of the table, was my seat, not at the head where I had sat for over 30 years, but tucked quietly near the corner, beside the sideboard where the light didn't quite reach, and I paused for half a second, long enough to understand that this wasn't an accident. Then I smiled, the same polite smile I had worn at countless family dinners, and took my seat without a word, folding my napkin neatly across my lap as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just been gently pushed out of my own place in my own home. And Vanessa, sitting comfortably where I used to be, glanced up at me with that perfectly practiced expression, the kind that looked warm to anyone who didn't know better, and said, "Oh, Margaret, I hope you don't mind. We thought this arrangement would feel more modern." And the word lingered in the air just long enough to carry its real meaning. And I nodded once, slow and measured, because I had learned a long time ago that not every move deserved an immediate response. Sometimes silence said more than anything else ever could. And Daniel didn't look at me, not even for a second, his attention fixed on pouring wine into Vanessa's glass, careful, attentive, the way he used to be with me when he was younger. And I watched the way her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, relaxed, confident, like someone who believed she was completely in control of the room. And for a moment, I simply observed, taking in every detail, the slightly forced laughter, the subtle glances exchanged between them, the way my presence seemed to exist just outside the center of their world. And I realized then that this wasn't about a seat or a dinner or even a single comment. This was something that had been building quietly over time, layer by layer, moment by moment, until it finally took shape right in front of me. And instead of feeling the sting I might have once felt, there was only a calm clarity settling in my chest, a quiet understanding that whatever game Vanessa believed she was playing tonight, she had already misjudged one very important thing, because patience is not something you give freely when it's being tested. And as I reached for my glass of water, steady and deliberate, I caught her watching me, waiting perhaps for a reaction, for a flicker of discomfort or irritation, something she could use, but I gave her nothing, not even a hint, just a small, composed smile. And in that moment, I knew the evening wasn't going to unfold the way she expected it to, not at all. Vanessa lifted her glass and smiled across the table as if she were hosting a perfectly ordinary evening, her voice light and polished as she began describing a weekend trip they had taken without mentioning it to me beforehand, a detail she slipped in casually, almost elegantly, as though it were an afterthought. But I noticed the way her eyes flickered toward me after every sentence, measuring, waiting, and I understood that none of this was accidental. Every word was placed carefully, like stepping stones leading somewhere she wanted me to follow, and I chose not to move, not yet. I simply listened, nodding once or twice at the appropriate moments, letting her fill the silence she had created, because people who are certain they are in control tend to reveal far more than they intend to when no one interrupts them. And Daniel laughed at something she said, a little too quickly, a little too eagerly, and I could not remember the last time he had laughed that way at anything I had said, which was not surprising, but it was still something I noted, quietly, without judgment, just another small piece settling into place. And when Vanessa mentioned the renovations they were planning for the house, her tone shifted just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to hear what was underneath. She spoke about changes, about updating the space, about making it more suitable for their future. And she said it while sitting in my seat, at my table, in the house I had spent decades maintaining, and she did not once include me in that future she described. Not directly, not even as an afterthought. And that was when I realized the dinner was not just a test of patience. It was a quiet declaration, a way of redrawing boundaries without ever saying the words out loud. And I rested my hands calmly on either side of my plate, feeling the smooth surface of the table beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something solid, something real, as her voice continued to flow, confident, uninterrupted. And then she turned to me, finally, offering me the opening she had been building toward. "What do you think, Margaret?" Do you like the direction we are taking with everything? And the question hung there, light on the surface but heavy underneath, and I could feel Daniel's attention shift slightly, not enough to meet my eyes, but enough to register that he was waiting for my answer too. And I took a small sip of water before responding, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted them to feel the pause, to understand that I was not reacting, I was choosing. And when I set the glass back down, I met Vanessa's gaze fully for the first time that evening, steady, calm, and completely unreadable. And in that moment, I could see it, just for a second, the smallest crack in her composure. The brief uncertainty that comes when a plan does not unfold exactly as expected, and I answered her simply, my voice even, measured. I think it is interesting how decisions are being made. And I let the words settle without adding anything more, without explaining, without softening them. And the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not empty. It was full, dense with meaning. And for the first time since I had walked into that dining room, Vanessa did not speak immediately. She hesitated, just long enough for me to know that she had heard exactly what I meant, even if no one else at the table fully understood it yet. And I folded my hands again, returning to stillness, because the evening was only just beginning, and I had no intention of rushing what was about to unfold. Vanessa recovered quickly, faster than most people would have, and I gave her that much credit as she let out a soft laugh, tilting her head slightly as if my response had been nothing more than a charming curiosity. Well, of course, we are just trying to make things more efficient for everyone, she said, her tone light again. But there was a subtle tightness at the edges now, something carefully controlled, and I watched the way her fingers curled just slightly around the stem of her glass. A small shift, but enough to tell me that she had not expected resistance, not even in the form of a simple observation. And Daniel finally glanced in my direction, just for a second, as if trying to read something in my expression, but I offered him nothing more than the same calm composure I had maintained all evening. And he looked away again, retreating back into the comfort of silence, which told me more than any words ever could, and the conversation moved on, or at least it pretended to, drifting into safer territory, work updates, social plans, surface-level details that sounded normal to anyone listening from the outside. But underneath it all, there was a tension now, quiet but unmistakable, like the air before a storm that no one wanted to acknowledge. And I noticed how Vanessa began to speak a little more quickly, filling every gap before it could fully form, as though she was trying to regain a rhythm she had momentarily lost. And it was in that effort that she revealed something else, something even more telling. She started referencing decisions again, but this time more directly, mentioning contractors, timelines, and costs, details that had clearly been discussed and agreed upon without my knowledge. And she spoke as though these plans were already in motion, already inevitable, as though my role in all of it had been quietly concluded without ever requiring my consent. And I let her continue, because there is a certain clarity that comes when you allow someone to fully present their intentions without interruption. And as she talked, I found myself remembering small moments from the past few months, things that had seemed insignificant at the time. A missed phone call here, a changed schedule there, a conversation that ended just a little too quickly when I entered the room, each one a fragment that now fit together with a precision that was impossible to ignore. And I realized that this dinner was not the beginning of anything. It was the result of something that had been carefully constructed over time, something deliberate, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle deeper within me. Not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from understanding. Because once you see the pattern clearly, it becomes much harder for anyone to convince you that it is not there. And when Vanessa paused again, briefly, as if deciding whether to continue or shift direction, I gently placed my fork down beside my plate, the soft sound drawing just enough attention to bring the focus back to me without any effort at all. And I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a steadiness that carried its own weight. It is impressive how much has been arranged without a single conversation. And I left it there, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. And this time, the silence that followed was not one Vanessa could immediately fill. It stretched just a little longer, just enough for the truth of the moment to settle into the space between us. And I held her gaze again, not with hostility, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And for the first time that evening, I saw it clearly, not just the crack in her composure, but the realization behind it, the understanding that whatever control she believed she had, it was no longer as complete as she had assumed. Vanessa did not respond right away, and that was the first true shift of the evening, not loud or dramatic, but unmistakable, like a subtle change in pressure that only someone paying close attention would notice. And I saw the way her posture adjusted, her shoulders drawing back just slightly as she recalibrated, searching for a way to regain the ground she had been so certain was hers. "Well, I assumed we were all on the same page," she said finally, her tone still composed but no longer effortless, and I tilted my head just a fraction, not in disagreement, not even in challenge, but in quiet acknowledgement of the words she had chosen, because assumptions, I had learned, were often the most convenient tools for people who preferred not to ask questions they might not like the answers to. And Daniel shifted in his seat, the faint scrape of his chair against the hardwood floor sounding louder than it should have in the stillness that had settled over the table. And for a moment, I wondered if he would say something, anything, but he remained where he was, caught between the comfort of silence and the discomfort of reality. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know, and I let my gaze move briefly across the room, taking in the familiar details that had not changed, the framed photographs along the wall, the china cabinet I had carefully arranged years ago, the small imperfections that only someone who had lived in a place for decades would recognize, and I felt a quiet certainty settle deeper within me, because while Vanessa spoke of changes and plans and futures, she was doing so in a space that still carried the weight of everything that had come before her, everything that could not simply be rearranged or redefined by a few confident decisions. And when I looked back at her, I did not rush to respond. I allowed the silence to stretch just a little longer, not as a tactic, but as a natural extension of the moment, because there are times when silence is not empty. It is full of meaning that does not need to be explained. And when I finally spoke, my voice remained even, steady, without any trace of sharpness. "Assumptions tend to work best when they are shared," I said, and I could see it again, that brief flicker behind her eyes, the recognition that the conversation was no longer following the path she had intended, and she smiled. But this time it did not reach her eyes. It was practiced, controlled, and just a little too deliberate, and she reached for her glass again, taking a small sip as if to create a pause she could manage. But the rhythm had already changed, and Daniel cleared his throat softly, as though he might step in, but instead he picked up his fork and focused on his plate, retreating once more into the safety of inaction. And I realized then that this was not just about Vanessa or even about the dinner itself. It was about a pattern that had been allowed to grow unchecked, a series of small decisions, small silences, that had led us all to this exact moment. And I felt no urgency, no need to rush or escalate, because the truth, once it begins to surface, has a way of continuing on its own. And I rested my hands lightly on the table again, calm, composed, fully present, knowing that whatever came next, I would meet it the same way I had met everything else that evening, without giving away anything that was not mine to give, and certainly not the patience she had come expecting to take. Vanessa set her glass down with a soft, deliberate motion, the faint clink against the table just a touch sharper than before, and when she looked at me again, the warmth she had been performing earlier had cooled into something more direct, more revealing. "I just think it makes sense to move forward efficiently," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that had not been there at the beginning of the evening, especially when some people are not really keeping up with everything anymore. And the words landed exactly where she intended them to, subtle enough to deny if challenged, but clear enough to be understood. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls were waiting to see how I would respond. And Daniel shifted again, his hand hovering near his glass before pulling back, his eyes flickering between us, but never settling. And I noticed how quickly Vanessa glanced at him, just for a fraction of a second, as though confirming that he would remain exactly where he was, silent, compliant, predictable. And that small glance told me more than anything she had said out loud, because it revealed that this was not just her performance. It was something they had both rehearsed in their own quiet ways, something they had both allowed to become normal, and I felt a stillness settle over me, not the kind that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from recognition. Because there is a moment when everything stops feeling uncertain and starts feeling clear, and this was that moment. And instead of reacting, instead of correcting or defending or explaining, I simply reached for my napkin and adjusted it slightly on my lap. A small, unhurried movement that seemed to disrupt the tension in a way words never could. And when I looked back up, I did not raise my voice. I did not sharpen my tone. I did not give her anything she could push against. I only met her gaze with the same calm certainty I had held all evening. And I said, "It is interesting how quickly people decide who is no longer part of the conversation." And I let the words rest there, without emphasis, without elaboration, because they did not need it. And this time, Vanessa did not smile right away. She held my gaze a fraction longer than before, as if trying to find something in it, some sign of hesitation or weakness that she could use to regain control, but there was nothing there for her to take. And I could see it then, clearly, the shift that had been building since the moment I walked into that room. The realization settling in behind her eyes that whatever position she thought she had secured, it was not as stable as she had believed, and Daniel exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to hear, and I knew that he felt it too. The change in the air, the shift in balance, the subtle but undeniable movement away from the version of the evening that had been planned, and I rested my hands gently on the table again, not as a gesture of surrender, but as a quiet declaration of presence, because I was still here, fully aware, fully engaged, and no longer willing to be quietly moved to the side of a conversation that had once been mine, and the silence that followed was no longer uncomfortable. It was revealing, and for the first time that evening, it did not belong to Vanessa anymore. Daniel finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried that careful neutrality I had come to recognize over the years, the kind that tries to smooth over tension without ever truly addressing it. "Mom, I think Vanessa just means we are trying to make things easier going forward," he said, his tone measured, almost rehearsed, and I turned my attention to him slowly, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement that this moment had been waiting beneath the surface all evening. And I noticed the way he avoided holding my gaze for more than a second, his eyes drifting toward his plate, toward Vanessa, toward anywhere that did not require him to stand fully in what he was saying. And that hesitation spoke louder than his words ever could, because it revealed the distance that had grown between us, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in small increments that had gone unchallenged for far too long. And Vanessa relaxed slightly at his response, her shoulders easing as if reassured that the balance was tilting back in her favor, and she gave him a small, approving glance that she likely believed went unnoticed. But nothing about this evening was going unnoticed, not anymore. And I let a brief silence settle after his statement, not to create discomfort, but to allow the weight of it to fully exist in the room, because there are moments when people need to hear their own words echo back at them, even if no one repeats them out loud. And I folded my hands together gently, resting them on the table as I considered him, really considered him, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man sitting across from me now, making choices, aligning himself, shaping a reality that I was clearly no longer a central part of. And when I spoke, my voice remained steady, calm, without accusation. "Easier for whom?" I asked, and the question was simple, almost understated, but it did not leave much room for avoidance. And Daniel shifted again, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his napkin as if searching for the right answer, the safe answer, the one that would not disrupt the fragile balance he had been trying to maintain. And Vanessa was quick to step in, her voice returning with a touch more firmness this time. "For everyone, Margaret, that is all we are saying," she replied. But there was a subtle sharpness now, a hint of impatience that had not been there before, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her response, without conceding to it, because I understood what she was trying to do: redirect, generalize, blur the edges of something that had just been made clear, and I chose not to follow her there, not to allow the conversation to slip back into something vague and unchallenged, and instead, I held my focus where it belonged, on the question itself, letting it linger in the space between us, unanswered in any meaningful way. And that was enough, because sometimes the absence of an answer reveals more. than any explanation ever could. And I could see it in Daniel's expression, the brief flicker of discomfort he could not quite hide. The realization that there was no simple way to frame this that did not expose the truth underneath it. And I did not press further. I did not need to, because the moment had already shifted. The illusion of ease, of quiet agreement, had been gently but firmly disrupted, and I remained exactly where I was, composed, present, and fully aware that whatever came next would no longer be on their terms alone. The silence stretched just long enough to settle into something undeniable, and I could see it now, not just in Vanessa, but in Daniel as well, the quiet realization that the conversation had moved beyond the comfortable edges they had prepared for. And I let that moment exist without rushing to fill it, because there is a certain clarity that only comes when no one is trying to control what happens next. And then, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I reached for the small leather folder I had placed beside my chair earlier that evening, something neither of them had paid much attention to when I arrived, and I opened it slowly, deliberately, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a natural continuation of everything that had already been unfolding. And I slid a single sheet of paper across the table, stopping it just within Vanessa's reach, not forcing it on her, simply placing it where it could not be ignored. And for a second, neither of them moved, as if unsure whether this was part of the same quiet conversation or something entirely different. And Vanessa glanced down first, her eyes scanning the page quickly, and I watched. The exact moment her expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else might notice at first glance, but enough, just enough for me to see that she understood what she was looking at. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, curiosity pulling him closer despite himself, and I allowed them both the time to read, because there was no need to explain something that was already clear. And when Vanessa finally looked back up at me, her composure was still there, but it was no longer effortless. It was held together, maintained, and that difference mattered. I thought it might be helpful, I said calmly, to make sure we are all working with the same information. And Daniel reached for the paper then, his eyes moving more slowly across the lines, his expression shifting from confusion to something more focused, more serious. And I could see the moment the details began to settle in, the recognition of what had been documented, what had been arranged, and more importantly, what had not been changed, despite whatever assumptions had been made. And I rested my hands lightly on the table again, not pressing, not pushing, simply allowing the truth to exist in the space between us, because that was all it needed. And Vanessa exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, before placing the paper back down with a controlled motion. And when she spoke again, her voice was measured, careful. "I do not see how this changes anything," she said, but there was a subtle strain beneath the words now, something that had not been there before. And I met her gaze evenly, without challenge, without satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that did not need to announce itself. "It does not change anything," I replied. "It clarifies it." And that was the difference, the simple, undeniable difference, because whatever narrative had been forming around me, whatever version of events had been quietly constructed, it could not hold up against something concrete, something real. And Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly, the paper still in his hand, his silence no longer passive, but thoughtful, unsettled. And for the first time that evening, the balance of the room felt different, not because anyone had raised their voice or forced a confrontation, but because the truth had been placed, calmly and deliberately, exactly where it needed to be, and there was no taking it back now. The room did not erupt, it did not shatter, it simply shifted in a way that could not be undone. And that was far more powerful than any raised voice ever could have been, because now everything that had been implied was quietly sitting in plain view, and neither Vanessa nor Daniel could pretend not to see it anymore. And Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as she studied me with a new kind of focus, one that was no longer confident, but careful, calculated, as if she were trying to determine how much I knew and how far I was willing to go. And for a moment, she said nothing, which in itself was an answer, and Daniel finally set the paper down, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a slow, deliberate motion that suggested he was still processing what he had just read. And when he looked up, his expression was no longer distant. It was searching, unsettled, and directed toward Vanessa. not me, and that was when. The balance shifted completely. Because the silence between them was different from the silence that had existed earlier. It was no longer protective. It was questioning, and Vanessa noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture straightened just a fraction, the way her composure tightened as she prepared to regain control of something that was already slipping. "I think we are overcomplicating things," she said, her voice steady but no longer effortless. "This does not change our plans." And there it was, the attempt to move forward as if nothing had been disrupted, as if clarity could simply be set aside in favor of convenience. And I did not respond immediately. I did not need to, because the shift was already happening without me. And Daniel did something then that he had not done all evening. He spoke without looking to her first. "When were you planning to tell me about this?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. And Vanessa turned toward him, her expression controlled. But there was a flicker there, a brief hesitation that she could not fully hide. "We talked about it," she replied quickly, but the words lacked the certainty they had carried before, and Daniel shook his head slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in recognition. "No, we talked about ideas," he said. "This is not the same thing." And I remained where I was, silent, composed, watching the conversation unfold without stepping into it. Because this part no longer required my voice, it required theirs. And Vanessa exhaled slowly, her patience thinning now, the polished calm beginning to fracture under the weight of something she could not fully control. "We are trying to move forward," she insisted, but Daniel did not respond right away, and that hesitation, that pause, was everything, because it meant he was no longer simply following, he was thinking, questioning, and once that begins, it is very difficult to stop. And I reached for my glass again, taking a small, measured sip, grounding myself in the quiet certainty that had carried me through the evening, because I understood something that Vanessa was only just beginning to realize. Control does not disappear all at once. It fades, slowly, in moments like this, when the narrative you have built no longer aligns with what others can clearly see. And when I set the glass back down, I did not interrupt. I did not guide. I simply remained present, because the truth had already done what it needed to do, and there was nothing left for me to prove. Daniel did not look at Vanessa this time when he spoke again, and that alone told me everything had changed, not completely, not irreversibly, but enough to break the rhythm that had carried them this far, and his voice, though still controlled, carried something new beneath it, something that had not been present earlier that evening. "We should have talked about this together," he said, and Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly, the composure she had maintained beginning to show its strain in small, almost imperceptible ways, and she opened her mouth as if to respond, but then paused, recalculating, searching for a version of this moment that she could still manage, and I watched her carefully, not with hostility, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet awareness that comes when the outcome is no longer uncertain. And I realized then that there was nothing left for me to add, nothing left to clarify or reveal, because everything that needed to be seen had already been placed in front of them. And I reached for my napkin once more, folding it neatly beside my plate, the motion simple, unhurried, deliberate, and when I stood, the sound of my chair moving against the floor was soft but unmistakable, drawing their attention back to me without a single word. And Daniel looked up immediately, his expression shifting as if he wanted to say something, to stop me perhaps, or to explain, but I did not give him that space, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity, because some moments do not require discussion, they require recognition, and I met his eyes briefly, just long enough to acknowledge that he had finally stepped out of the silence he had been hiding in. And then I turned my attention to Vanessa, who was watching me now with a different kind of focus, no longer certain, no longer in control, and I held her gaze for a moment, calm, steady, and entirely without anger, because anger would have given her something to push against, something to use, and I had no intention of offering that. And instead, I simply said, "I do not repeat myself," my voice even, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation, and the words settled between us with a finality that did not need to be reinforced. And for a brief second, no one moved, no one spoke, and in that stillness, I could feel the weight of everything that had led to this moment, every small dismissal, every quiet assumption, every unspoken decision, and I understood that walking away was not a retreat. It was a choice, a deliberate step out of a conversation that no longer required my presence to continue. And I picked up my bag from beside the chair, the familiar leather worn smooth, from years of use. And as I turned toward the doorway, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that I needed to check. And the house, the room, the table, all of it remained exactly where it had always been. But something within it had shifted, something that could not be quietly rearranged or ignored. And as I stepped out of the dining room, I carried with me the only thing that had ever truly belonged to me. Not the seat at the table, not the space within the house, but the certainty of who I was and what I would no longer accept. And that, I knew, was something no one could move or redefine without my permission.